Okay, and we are back for the conclusion, the exciting conclusion of chapter 17.3. This is part 3 of that chapter. I broke it up into 3 sections because there's just so much stuff in that chapter that we wouldn't be able to do any of it justice if we crammed it all into one slideshow. All right, so here we go. All right, learning objective. Today I can explain the events that led to the end of the Civil War. Let's do a little bit of review. So, to review from where we left off last week, Lee's rebel army was defeated at Gettysburg in 1863. The South surrendered Vicksburg, Mississippi on July 4th, 1863. That was the day after Lee surrendered at Gettysburg. And then Ulysses S. Grant continued scoring victories against the Confederacy out west. So today we're going to learn that Grant engages Lee in a series of bloody battles in the Eastern Theater. And then William Tecumseh Sherman and the March to the Sea. We're going to learn about that. And then we're going to learn about Lee surrendering to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. So many of you know who this is already. We've talked about him a little bit when we talked about Fort Henry and Donelson and the battle at Shiloh. He fought in the Mexican-American War too, but this is Ulysses S. Grant, born in 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio. If you remember, Lincoln had been really disappointed by his generals so far. So McClellan, Burnside, Pope, Hooker, and Meade. Lincoln's biggest complaint was that they had failed to completely and decisively defeat Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And you remember McClellan would not follow Lee after Lee's retreat from Antietam, and Meade did not follow Lee after Lee's retreat from Gettysburg. And Lincoln was tired of this thing happening over and over again. He wanted this war over. He needed a general that would pursue and destroy Lee's army. So Ulysses Grant had been really successful in the West. In 1864, spring of 1864, he was given command over all Union armies. So now Lincoln thinks he has the general that he needs. So the war is about to change, and yes, it does change. So we start with something called the Overland Campaign. So this begins in the spring of 1864, and it's a series of battles between Grant's army and Lee's army. This may be the bloodiest few months of the war. It's going to get really ugly in Virginia over this spring of 1864. So what was Lincoln banking on? How is Grant going to be different than these other generals who had been so disappointing so far? Well, here's what other generals did. They would disengage from the enemy after a battle. So take, for example, Gettysburg. You have the Union under Meade fighting the Confederacy under Lee. Once that battle's over, Lee begins to retreat, and Meade just lets him retreat. He does not follow him. He disengages. He's no longer confronting him. That gave the Confederacy time to recover and regroup. Grant, on the other hand, he's going to keep the pressure on Lee. He's never going to let the Confederacy have a chance to recover or regroup. It's kind of like they used to say, grab him by the belt. Keep close to your opponent at all time. So Grant is going to use the Union's superior numbers to finish Lee once and for all. So that's what I was saying before. He wants to keep the pressure on Lee. So this map shows the two armies as they faced each other. So in the past, after a conflict, let's say right here, the Battle of the Wilderness, so that's an engagement from May of 1864. If we were one of the old generals, and the Union is using the color blue here to indicate where their armies are, if we were one of the previous generals before Grant, McClellan, for example, he might fight Lee here for a day or two at the Wilderness, and when the battle's over, they'll both kind of retreat a little bit. Lee might go down here or move down towards Richmond or something like that, but there's no continuation of the fight, okay? This is the Overland Campaign, this map right here. So you can see as Grant wants to go down towards Richmond, that's part of the Anaconda Plan, gets into a battle at the Wilderness. Battle's over. Instead of retreating back towards Washington, he just goes again on the same flank, and he goes to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and he keeps going all the way down here. He does not let up. That's why you see this doing, 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 this series of battles, one right after another in that spring. So I've mentioned this to you guys before. This is my great-great-grandfather, William Landolt. He was alive from 1843 to 1911. He fought in the Overland Campaign at some of these really, really horrible battles that took place. So this is him after the war. That's what a Civil War will do for you. He's a nice-looking young man right there. Looks good in his uniform. Here he is after the war. As you can see, he's missing a leg. He loses that in 1865 in this war. Pretty interesting character. We don't have too much time to study him. All right. So this is a close-up of the map that is in your book. I know most of you have returned your books already, and thank you for that. But this shows the series of battles with some dates from that spring of 1864. You see Wilderness, you see Spotsylvania Courthouse. There's another one called North Anna in here. and then Cold Harbor, and then it ends down at Petersburg, which is actually, if you look at this map, you might think that's curious. Well, it's south of Richmond. How come Grant just didn't go at Richmond? Well, because it was being blocked by Lee, but he goes down here, and in Petersburg, there's some really important railroad lines that supply Richmond from the south. So Grant is going to take those and kind of start choking out Richmond. So these are your major battles. And just to give you an idea of how deadly this was in such a short amount of time, look at the dates on here. So we have the Wilderness, May 5th to May 7th. We have Spotsylvania Courthouse, the 8th to the 21st. We have North Anna, the 23rd to the 26th. We have Cold Harbor, May 31st to June 12th. And then the Petersburg siege begins on June 15th. So from May 5th to June 15th, that's just a little over a month. That's not even 6 weeks. 90,000 casualties in just 6 weeks. It is a bloodbath in Virginia. So this is a memorial. This is at the the battlefield for Spotsylvania Courthouse. This is Upton's charge. It was a Union action to break out or to kick out some Confederates from a trench system they have. And this is the 5th Wisconsin Infantry. This is my great-great-grandpa was part of this action. All right, so in the West, we're talking all that stuff about the Overland Campaign in the Eastern Front or Eastern Theater in Virginia mainly. But in the West, one of Grant's most trusted generals was a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman, William T. Sherman. He captures Atlanta, Georgia in September 1864. A lot of people consider Sherman to be the first modern general for the way he views war. Then what I mean by that is that he realized that the Confederate Army and the Confederacy itself was supported by the people, plantations, railroads, and other resources in the South. So he plans to wage total war against the South, not just the Southern Army. So he's going to work on destroying plantations, railroads, and other resources in the South as a way of taking away the South's ability to continue to fight. So we call this the March to the Sea. And it takes place in November and December of 1864. So after Sherman captures Atlanta, he doesn't want the Confederates using any of the stuff that remains in Atlanta for their own benefit. So he burns the city of Atlanta to the ground, wipes it off the face of the earth, pretty much. So during this march, what his plan is to march south and east towards Savannah, Georgia. And on the way, he's going to destroy everything in his path. So his army lived off the land, meaning they were eating crops from the fields. They were taking it away from the people that lived in the South. They raided farms for livestock so they could eat meat. They raided homes in the South. They stole food. They burned houses and factories, specifically if people in the houses were sympathetic to the Confederate cause and tried to block the Union anyway. They burned their stuff down. So the Union Army under Sherman also tore up railroad tracks, making it impossible for the Confederacy to move supplies around the South. This is just something that's going to really cripple the South, this March to the Sea. And you see, there's not a whole lot of time between the March to the Sea and the end of the war in 1865. So here's the reasoning for Sherman again. He reasoned that the people of the South supported the Confederacy, and if that support could be removed and the Southerners lost the will to fight on, then the Confederacy would collapse. There's a short video on the March to the Sea right here. I want you to watch that. All right. So Sherman's army, right before Christmas, they reached, this is the path. Sherman broke his men into two columns, and they just cut across Georgia like this and destroyed everything in their path. So I think it was about 60 miles wide and 300 miles long or something like that. But he gets to Savannah, Georgia around Christmas, and Sherman presents Savannah, Georgia to Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas present. And the South never forgets this. If you want to anger some people in the South right now, go down there and start talking about how much you like William T. Sherman. Especially go do that in Georgia. They're not going to have nice words for you. I can guarantee that. He's very, very controversial. And this whole campaign, the March to the Sea, is still controversial to this day. So I'll go back. So the plan was to, once he gets down to Savannah, the plan was to then start moving up through the Carolinas and doing the same thing in the Carolinas that he did in Georgia. And eventually he's going to follow all the way up into Virginia and link up with Grant to fight Lee. So back to the east, we're going to look at Petersburg, where we left off. So the siege there, remember, a siege is where you surround an enemy and don't let supplies in. You slowly starve them out or choke them off or something like that. That's a good way to describe it. So this siege lasted from June 1864 until April 1865, and we see trench warfare and fortifications dug by soldiers. If you look at Petersburg and what happened there during this siege, it's almost like a preview of what happened. For those of you who know how fighting was conducted in the West in World War I, it's trench warfare, very similar. So at one point, this is just a quick story. I'd like to have more time to go into it, but at one point, the Union tries to dig under the Confederate lines and blow them up. This plan backfires and causes 4,000 Union casualties in something called the Battle of the Crater, which was a small part of the siege of Petersburg. And this is still there. You can go there. This is from last summer. You can still go in to that tunnel and you can follow down. Well, you can only follow it down a couple feet before you're blocked off. But it went hundreds of feet down underneath the Confederates. They put a huge bomb in there and blew up the Confederates. They had to be creative when you're trying to break a siege like that. All right, so finally, the Confederates surrender. It's the fall of Richmond. After 9 months at Petersburg, Lee realizes that he can't last much longer. At that point, 25,000 Confederates had already deserted. That just means they leave the army without permission. Most of them were just tired and hungry, and they found out because of things like the March to the South that their families at home were suffering and they were poor and didn't have anything to eat, so they wanted to go back to help their families. So he's losing men to desertion, and he's under siege. So he tells Jefferson Davis, hey, look, we can't control Petersburg anymore. You need to get out of Richmond. You got to go on the run. So Confederate leaders burn Richmond to the ground so the Union can't use any of its resources. That's a picture of the burning of Richmond in 1865, April 1865. So from Petersburg, Lee and his army flee to the west. They lose a battle at Sailor's Creek on April 6th. That's where my great-great-grandpa lost his leg. Then Lee makes it to the small town of Appomattox Courthouse and realizes that his situation is hopeless, and he sends a message to Grant. So Robert E. Lee surrenders his Army of Northern Virginia to Grant on April 9th, 1865. Grant gave the Confederates generous terms. He said they could keep their horses and other possessions before returning home because it was spring after all, and those guys were going to need their horses to help them plant crops for the fall. There's a famous rendering of that moment in history. Very, very important moment. Thank you for your time. I will talk to you soon.